everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the term overtraining, because I feel like it gets thrown around way too casually and people don't really understand what it is and they misuse it. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And when I say that people misuse it, I mean people misuse it in both directions, meaning there are people who think that it's something that happens really easily. There are people who think that it doesn't exist. There are people who use it as a marketing term. Now, there are people who are literally using it to mean something good, like, oh, I overtrained a muscle group to make it bigger. Which, now that one is probably the most ignorant and moronic version of it, but it sounds good, doesn't it? Because, you know, people have been taught on the other end for years and years from the whole bodybuilding world that overtraining is something that happens really, really easily. It happens really easily, and so then a lot of people came out later, guys like C.T. Fletcher, and said, oh, there's no such thing as overtraining, which is provably false. Overtraining can be diagnosed by a sports physician. It is an actual legitimate medical condition that can be diagnosed, and if you are truly overtrained, oftentimes you need to be hospitalized. This is actually a serious problem in professional athletes and elite level athletes. It's actually a very serious problem. You know, the problem we run into, though, is that it's overuse, and that was where we've run into the big issue. Yes, overtraining is absolutely real. Saying overtraining isn't real is like saying cancer isn't real, right? I mean, you're going to sound extremely ignorant if you say something like that when it's a medically diagnosable medical condition. The problem is that people have tried to turn it into an action. It's like saying, I'm going to cancer my biceps. You're not, it's that silly. It's a medical condition. It's a systematic medical condition that is a result of chronic overreaching, which is what a lot of people are now using as a term overtraining, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the biggest problem we have, though, is that it was overhyped, and it was this whole thing, oh, you don't want to train a muscle group more than once a week because you'll overtrain, which was the silly bodybuilding mantra. And the truth is, when you look at different studies that have come out over the decades, optimal, and we shouldn't chase the word optimal. Optimal is a word we need to be very careful of in the training and nutrition world. But ideal frequencies of training actually seem to be somewhere between 2 and 5 times a week for a given lift or muscle group. Like if we're talking about maximum hypertrophy, maximum performance. And in fact, we actually do get data coming out now, like when you start looking at the studies in the Bulgarian style training, that actually training a lift up to 7 days a week can have strength benefits. There are performance benefits to that. And it makes sense when you look at it from just the way that the body works. If you want to get good at something, shouldn't you practice it all the time? Anything but lifting, that makes total sense to us, doesn't it? You want to get good at throwing a basketball, you should probably throw a basketball every day, right? Not once a week. You know, you're going to overtrain your basketball throwing skills otherwise. I mean, come on. But, you know, what we're dealing with is practice and skill learning versus recovery, because resistance training has a definite recovery component. But ultimately, because of all that and the promotion of bro splits and all this other nonsense, most people do undertrain. So because we had a whole marketing push all through the 80s towards HIIT and all this other stuff, the term overtraining came to be used too frequently in the sense of, oh, it's so easy to overtrain. And the truth is, it actually isn't that easy to overtrain. The majority of people out there lifting are in no danger of it. And particularly people who are coming in doing a bunch of cable work and stuff. Now, could you get overuse injuries and snap tendons and things from all that? Sure. You can get calcification of tendons, tendinitis, all sorts of stuff from excessive amounts of fluff and puff. All this fluff and pump exercises, they can do that, sure. But that's not overtraining, is it? That's not overtraining. That's localized overuse causing inflammation in tendons and all sorts of stuff. They can cause injuries, but overtraining is a systematic thing. And yeah, you're honestly not really in danger of overtraining if your idea of working out is to do a couple sets of bench press and a bunch of cable flies and tricep extensions. Okay, that's not, you're unlikely to accumulate enough workloads doing that. But coming in and doing 10 sets of squats, followed by 5 sets of deadlifts with too much volume and too much workload with too much frequency, that could push you into overtraining. But the majority of people who the whole term was marketed to, it actually appealed to their laziness. So when you have people like C.T. Fletcher coming out saying, hey, no such thing as overtraining, it's because the majority of people do undertrain. because they've been told to be scared of overtraining. But the reality is overtraining is very, very real. It is a real thing. It is absolutely a real thing. And when you start reaching the actual overtrained condition, you start getting tons of muscle cramping. You start seeing a reduction in strength. Things like your resting heart rate starts going up. Your blood pressure goes up. And I mean when you're laying in bed at night. Like those are symptoms of true overtraining. Is that when you are laying in bed at night, not on stims, you didn't take a bunch of pre-workouts, you didn't take clenbuterol, and your heart rate sits at 100 beats per minute. You have elevated blood pressure with no drugs in your system that would explain it. You start getting cramps in your lower back, your hamstrings. Your lifts start going down. Your 300 bench turns into you get pinned under 255. Like you go to do 255 for a set of 5 and you get pinned on the first rep, or you can only do 1 and it's like your max. All right, now we're starting to see signs of overtraining because it is a legitimate medical condition, and if it persists, you sometimes have to be hospitalized. Then you have what you see in CrossFit and everything, this whole rhabdo problem, which is a totally different situation. That's a non-chronic situation. That's an acute situation in which you've torn down muscle fibers. That's another silly nonsense thing you hear bodybuilders say, oh, you got to tear down muscle fibers. No, if you tear down muscle fibers, usually your pee turns red. That's the first sign that you've torn down muscle fibers. It's called rhabdo, which that's the short term for it. But that is actually not a good thing. That's silly bodybuilding, make-believe bullshit that tearing down muscle fibers builds muscle. See, that's just the shit you read in bodybuilding magazines. That's not reality. That's the sort of nonsense they come up with. You're not tearing down muscle fibers. If you do, that's rhabdo, and that is like an acute overstimulation, overwork from a single workout situation that occurs. But that's not actually overtraining. Overtraining is a systematic, long-term response to pushing beyond what you can recover from for too long and not ever backing down. Now, we have on the other end of things, we now have people who are marketing overtraining as a positive thing, and they'll say things like, oh yeah, I'm training a muscle every day, therefore I'm overtraining. And that's also nonsense. Because if you were truly overtrained, you would probably be in a hospital bed. You wouldn't be gaining strength, and you sure as hell wouldn't be gaining muscle. Usually once you're overtrained, you start losing muscle. Right? You actually start dropping muscle tissue. You start losing strength. It's not a good thing. But the reality is training a muscle even every day is not overtraining. You guys watched me do that for months. Like what, for 7 months straight, I ran Bulgarian training this year on camera. I was squatting and benching and overhead pressing and all that stuff every day pretty much. Like, or 6 days a week, right? And going heavy. Like not coming in doing 70, 80% of my maxes. I was coming in and hitting 90% of a max or higher day after day after day on multiple exercises, right? That is a proven system of training. It's actually even been researched further. It's actually, there are PhDs working on researching this to see the merits of it. They're finding it actually works pretty damn good for strength. But that's not overtraining. Training at high frequency is not overtraining. It's just high frequency training. But no one wants to call it that, do they? They don't want to call it daily training. They don't want to call it high frequency training. They are trying to call it overtraining, and it's based upon the whole bodybuilding buzzword that low frequency was how you avoided overtraining. Oh, don't train your chest more than once a week. Don't train your legs more than once a week or you'll overtrain. It's just actually a play on that make-believe nonsense from the bodybuilding world that is now being used to market stuff in a different direction. They're trying to say, oh, overtraining is a positive because they're trying to define high-frequency training as overtraining, which is a good thing. I mean, high-frequency training is a positive thing. I mean, realistically, the overwhelming majority of studies show that muscles grow faster if they are trained at least twice a week, right? Now, people say, well, these bodybuilders are jacked. Yeah, but they're using tons of drugs. The drugs are stimulating their growth. Their training isn't actually doing that much. It's the drugs doing 80, 90% of it. So it's not as big of a deal. But it's being marketed that way as a very high frequency training is overtraining, to the point where I've had people come into my video comments and say, well, I overtrained this muscle. I'm like, no, you didn't. If you overtrained, you would be getting medical help. You wouldn't be seeing gains. You just trained at a really high frequency, which is actually a very viable method. If you have something that you really want to increase, you have a weak point that you want to increase, something that you really need to bring up, training that exercise or training that muscle or that movement pattern every day actually is a pretty good idea. It actually works pretty well. It's based on good physiology. It's based on good exercise science. It should be based on common sense as well. But that's not overtraining. That's just prioritizing. And in fact, that is the best way to prioritize something, is to train it very, very frequently, as opposed to, oh, it needs its own day. Well, its own day every week. That's not going to work as well as training it every single day. But that isn't overtraining. So this is a term that people are throwing around way too loosely and incorrectly. So when people say that overtraining is really easy to do, well, that's not true. People who say overtraining doesn't exist, that's not true. And then people who are trying to spin other things as overtraining that aren't overtraining as a positive thing, well, that's not true either. And the reality is that all of this is nonsense. This is people not understanding that overtraining is a medical condition that exists in the body, as a condition in the body that happens as a result of training and overreaching for too long, for too many weeks or too many months, without ever backing down and allowing yourself to recover. So it's staying under recovered for an extended amount of time until your body starts giving out and saying, okay, I can't handle this anymore. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.